The Ochada family home was buzzing with excitement. The Christmas season was drawing near, and for the children, that meant the school trip was only a few days away. It was a tradition at the school to take a trip every year before the holiday break, and this Christmas was no different. Christabel, Janelle, and Jessica couldn't stop talking about their upcoming adventure. They had packed their bags, written their list of what to bring, and couldn't wait to get on the bus with their classmates. The air was filled with joy and energy as they discussed what they hoped the trip would be like. Can't wait for this trip. We're going to have so much fun. Jessica, the youngest at 12, exclaimed as she bounced around the living room. I'm so excited. I've heard this year's trip will be the best one yet. Janelle, who was 14, added. She was always the one who stayed calm and collected, but even she couldn't hide her excitement. I hope they have lots of game and activities. I want to make new friends, said Christabel, the oldest at 16. As she packed a few more items into her bag, Christabel was the leader of the three girls, and she made sure everything was in order. Even though she was excited, there was a bit of worry hidden in her eyes, but she didn't want her younger sisters to see it. Mr. Ochada, their father, was sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, smiling at the happy noise around him. He loved the Christmas season. It was always a time when the family felt specially close, and his children were more than ready for their school trip. He was sure that they would return with exciting stories to tell. You girls are going to have the best time ever, Mr. Chada said with a laugh as he looked over the list his daughters had made. You are all well prepared. I can't imagine you forgetting anything. I am worried about them, though, Mrs. Ochada said softly. Her voice tingled with concern as she stood in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had been quietly listening to the children's chatter, but there was a knot in her stomach that couldn't go away. What if something happens to them? I don't know. I just have this bad feeling about this trip. Mr. Chada turned his head towards his wife, reassuring her with a smile on his face. Don't worry, my darling. Everything will be fine. They are going to be perfectly safe. You know how well the school plans this trip. This is not the first time. Mrs. Ochada wasn't convinced. I just can't shake it off, Ochada said. Something feels wrong, like we should be doing more. Her husband stood up and walked over to her gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. We've done everything we can. They have prayed, they have been prayed for too, and they will be in good hands. Trust me, my love, nothing bad will happen to them. Mrs. Ochada nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. She had always been the most conscious in the family. She worried about everything, her children's safety, the weather, even the food they ate. But Mr. Ochada, the ever-optimistic one, believed everything would work out. He believed that his daughters would come back with happy memories to cherish, and he didn't want his wife's worry to cloud their excitement. I'll pray for them, Mrs. Ochada said quietly as she turned back to the dishes. You always do, Mr. Ochada said, his voice filled with warmth, and that's what matters the most. As the evening wore on, the children continued their chatter, eager to leave the next morning for their trip. They didn't notice the tension in the air between their parents. The worry that Mrs. Ochada felt was hidden beneath a calm exterior, but it lingered, and she couldn't quite shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as the family sat down to a simple dinner, the conversation shifted to other things. But in the back of Mrs. Ochada's mind, her concern stayed. She looked at her daughters, smiling and laughing, so full of life and excitement. They were her world, and the thought of anything happening to them made her heart ache. She forced herself to push the worry away, focusing instead on the love she had for them and the hope for that her prayers would be enough. The family slept soundly that night, unaware of the storm that was coming. The morning would bring the beginning of a journey, but no one could foresee the heartache that would follow. The morning moved quickly, filled with the usual bustle and excitement of a school trip day. The outside air was crisp and the hint of the December chill that will soon settle in for the holiday season. Inside the Ochada household, there was no sign of worry that Mrs. Ochada had carried with her over the night before. "Don't forget your gloves, Jessica," Mrs. Ochada called out to her youngest daughter, who dashed around the house. "I'm ready, Mom," Christabel beamed, throwing her bag over her shoulder. She looked at Janelle and Jessica, who were already waiting at the door, their bags neatly packed and ready to go. Janet, the 14-year-old, was always organized, making sure everything was in order before they left. She glanced at her mom, her eyes bright with a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We'll be fine, Mom," Janet said, trying to reassure her mother. "We're going to have so much fun, don't worry." Mrs. Ochada smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "I know, dear, I know. Just promise me you will stay safe, all of you." "I will, I promise," Janet replied. She reached over and gave her mother a quick hug. "We'll be back before you know it." Christabel was the most level-headed of the three, checked the clock and said, "We better go or we'll miss the bus." The children quickly filed out through the door, waving goodbye to their mom. Mr. Chada, who had been reading the morning paper, stood up and gave each of them a hug. "Have fun, girls," he said, his voice full of warmth. "We'll be praying for you." The school bus had already pulled up in front of their house when they stepped out. It was a big white Toyota vehicle, the kind that seemed to promise adventure and excitement. The driver, an older man with graying hair and glasses, waved from the front of the bus. He looked friendly enough, but his eyes seemed tired, as though he hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. "Morning, kids," he greeted them with a smile that seemed forced. "Ready for an adventure?" The girls nodded eagerly. Climbing on board the bus. Jessica found a seat by the window, and Janelle and Christabel followed suit, sitting a few rows back. They all chattered excitedly about the trip, planning to have a good time with their friends and enjoy the fun activities that had been promised. The bus filled with laughter and the sounds of voices talking over one another, as everyone eagerly anticipated what the day would bring. As the bus pulled over from the curb, Mrs. Ochada stood in the doorway watching them go. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and for a moment she stood frozen, watching the bus as it disappeared down the street. The nagging worry in her heart hadn't left her. She knew something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't put her fingers on it. Still, she forced herself to smile and step back inside the house. Her husband came to stand next to her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "They will be fine," he assured her, though he too couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled over him. "Trust me, I know," Mrs. Ochada whispered, her voice soft. "I just can't stop worrying. Let's pray," Mr. Ochada said, guiding her to the living room. "We'll pray for their safety. Nothing bad will happen." The bus rattled along the highway, its tires humming a rhythmic tune against the asphalt. The children's laughter and chatter filled the air, a sharp contrast to the heavy, overcast sky that loomed above. The weather seemed undecided. Jessica pressed her face against the glass, watching the trees zip past. "Look, Janelle, that one looks like a giant umbrella," she giggled, pointing at a tree with wide, spreading branches. Janelle leaned over to take a look. "You're right, maybe it's hiding elves underneath," she teased, earning a laugh from Jessica. Christabel, seated by the house, glanced at her sisters and smiled faintly. She admired their ability to find joy in the smallest things. Pulling her sweater closer around her shoulders, she turned her attention to the teachers seated near the front. They appeared calm, occasionally looking back to ensure everyone was behaving. The bus driver, however, seemed less composed. His face was set in a tight expression, his brows furrowed as he navigated the twisting road ahead. The once jovial whistling had stopped, replaced by a tense silence. He rubbed his temples briefly before returning both arms to the wheels. His movements a little too rigid. At the back of the bus, some boys had started a rowdy game of who can shout louder. Their booming voices filled the bus, but the driver didn't seem to notice. His focus was somewhere on the road, on the rear view mirror, and occasionally on the dashboard where a blinking light hinted at some mechanical issue. Christabel noticed it. Leaning towards her sister, she whispered, "Do you think something's wrong with the bus?" Janet snuggled. "I'm sure it's fine. They wouldn't let us go if it wasn't safe." Jessica, oblivious of the conversation, was busy sketching the umbrella-like tree in her notebook, adding tiny F's beneath it. The road ahead began to wind more sharply, the curves growing tightly as the bus climbed a hilly stretch. The children barely noticed, their attention fixed on their games and conversations. But the driver's tension was palpable. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white as he navigated a particular sharp turn. Suddenly, there was a loud pop, followed by a jarring thud. The bus lurched, and the children screamed as they were thrown against their seats. Christabel grabbed Jessica, holding her tightly, while Janet clutched the armrest, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" a boy shouted from the back. The driver struggled to regain control, his foot slamming on the brakes. The bus skidded, veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. A collective gasp filled the air as the vehicle tilted precariously before slamming back onto all four wheels. "Everyone, everyone, stay calm," one of the teachers shouted, her voice shaking. "It's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. The dashboard light flickered erratically, and the engine made a disturbing grinding noise. The driver pulled the bus to the side of the road, his hands trembling as he turned off the ignition. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The children murmured affirmation, though some were crying and others looked pale with fear. The teachers quickly moved to check on the students, offering soothing words and reassuring pats. Meanwhile, the driver stepped outside to inspect the bus. He crashed by the front tire, his face falling as he saw the shredded rubber and the faint trail of leaking fluid beneath the bus. The driver climbed into the bus, wiping his hands on a rag. "We've got a flat tire and a busted radiator," he announced grimly. "I'll call for a replacement bus. Everyone, stay seated and stay calm." The children initially relief was short-lived. The road was deserted with no sign of help in sight. The teachers did their best to keep spirits high, leading the students in songs and games, but uneasy hung in the air like a storm. We've come to the end of this particular first part of the story. See you in my next video upload for the part 2.